For over a century, the Catholic Church funded its growth and institutions by selling slaves. Priests bought and sold people while at the same time praying for their salvation. This dark chapter of the Church's history has been kept secret for years, but recently is gaining the public's attention. Their response? It's complicated. How did the Catholic Church profit from slavery? In the earliest days of the Christian Roman Empire, slavery was seen as a terrible thing. In 313, under the rule of Emperor Constantine, Christianity was officially legalized. Christianity soon became the most popular religion in Europe. With its teachings of charity and justice, Roman laws started to change. Soon slavery decreased dramatically. Through most of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, slavery was just another part of life. Romans owned slaves like modern people own shoes. But with Christianity, it became a sin to own a slave. By the 5th century, things had changed dramatically. Slavery wasn't completely gone though. It stuck around, got a little better, then got way worse. Members of the Catholic clergy after the Dark Ages held slaves. Popes were allowed to have slaves. As the Church grew more corrupt following the collapse of the Roman Empire, slavery became in style once more. The Papal States had their own naval ships, which they used to capture Muslim galleys. The Muslims they captured were then brought back to Rome and turned into slaves. There was a big demand for Muslim slaves in Europe throughout the centuries of the Crusades. Even some Catholic saints had slaves, such as Gregory of Tours and Philemon of Colossae. Things changed yet again with the discovery of the New World. Around the 15th century, the Church was starting to become a little less diabolical. There was a strong push to stifle slavery, but it didn't work very well when the Age of Discovery came around. With America being settled by new colonies and the transatlantic slave market booming, there wasn't much the Church could do. The Romanus Pontifex of 1454 was used by some church leaders to endorse slavery. Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull called Dum Diversas in June 1452. It recognized Portugal's rights to all its discovered territories in West Africa. It also claimed all non-Christians were infidels and could be legally taken as property. For the next couple of centuries, these ancient church documents were used to justify the enslavement of natives across the globe. There were some popes who condemned unjust enslavement, but this was largely ignored. Slavery was a very lucrative business for the slave owners. In 1741, Pope Benedict XIV issued a papal bull against the enslavement of indigenous people in any country. This was the beginning of the end. By 1888, nearly 100% of the church was vocally opposed to slavery. The House of Boura. During the Italian Renaissance, much of the church was controlled by a single family. The House of Boura may not be as infamous today as the Medici family, but they still had their hands in every Italian pie. They played a major role in politics, the papacy, and banking. There were other prominent ruling families who influenced the church, such as the House of Gonzaga and the House of Sforza, but the House of Boura was arguably the worst. They began their rise to power in the 15th century. They were patrons of the arts who slowly became rich, and the richer they got, the more influential they became. The first major player was Alphonse de Bourges. He was the grandfather of the family, born in 1378. He was a law professor in the Kingdom of Valencia, which was located in modern Spain. He changed from practicing law to becoming a cardinal. Then, in his very old age, he was elected pope. From 1455 until 1458, he ruled the church as Pope Calixtus III. The first Borgia pope wasn't particularly heinous. He even did some good, like changing the sentence for Joan of Arc. She was already dead, but he cleared her of the original charges. The biggest issue is that he appointed 2 of his nephews to be cardinals. At this point, the family was now safely embedded within the church. Rodrigo Borgia was appointed cardinal by his uncle, Pope Calixtus. It was a poor move because Rodrigo was very scandalous. He was notorious for fathering children with random women, but that didn't stop him from becoming pope in 1492. He was perhaps the worst papal ruler in history. Under the name Pope Alexander VI, he grew very corrupt. He spent the church's money and engaged in one of the worst heresies that Renaissance popes practiced a lot: simony. It's the practice of selling positions in the church. Any of the Pope's friends could get a job as long as they paid enough money. It had nothing to do with God and was all about cash. Pope Alexander also was guilty of nepotism, appointing his son and other family members to become cardinals. The worst heresy committed by Pope Alexander was on the night of October 31st, 1501. At the Papal Palace, Pope Alexander held a dinner party forever known as the Banquet of Chestnuts. It was a wild party in which the Pope supposedly hosted one of the biggest orgies in Vatican history. According to one account of the event, 50 prostitutes showed up by the Pope's orders. It was a lewd scene, and on Halloween no less. Some think the Borgia family was secretly consorting with Satan. Secrets of Papius. Saint Papius was one of the most important literary figures of the early Christian church. He published a massive volume of his interpretations of Jesus' teachings. Not very many surviving passages of his work remain. The few passages that are left include some rather unusual sayings of Jesus not found in the Gospels. He also wrote a weird account of what happened to the betrayer Judas Iscariot. Saint Papius was born sometime after the death of Jesus Christ, within about 20 or 30 years. It's believed he knew the apostles personally. He was the bishop of Hierapolis in Phrygia, which is modern Turkey. There isn't a ton of information about this guy, yet he was hugely important to the development of Christianity. For around 400 years after his death, Christian scholars continued to cite his interpretation of the Gospels. However, some think he may have been crazy. Church historian Eusebius of Caesarea said Papius was simple-minded. Maybe he was, or maybe he wasn't. Either way, his works have mysteriously vanished after they were such an important piece of Christian law for so many centuries. He was a key figure in the first days of Christianity after Jesus was gone. It's believed Papius traveled far and wide, meeting with the apostles and other people who knew Jesus. His goal was to scientifically record what really happened. Some believe this might be why his work was never taken seriously and why most of it is gone today. For example, Papius wrote of his meeting with Mark, the author of the earliest gospel. Papius claimed Mark admitted to him that he did not record the events of Jesus' ministry as they happened. Mostly he wrote from memory or from what Peter told him, interpreting Jesus' teachings in his own way. Papius also recorded an unknown resurrection of a corpse and an unconfirmed disciple named Justus Barsabbas. He also said before he died, Judas became swollen and stinking of death as if he were a bloated zombie. Nobody knows how seriously they take his accounts. Pope Benedict, Hitler Youth. After the death of Pope John Paul II in 2005, Benedict XVI took the throne at the Vatican as the new pope. At the time, Jewish leaders were very nervous about the new pope, who happened to be German. Their main issue was that although Joseph Ratzinger had seemingly lived a life devoted to God, he spent his younger years in the Hitler Youth. Joseph went from being a teenager praising Hitler to becoming the leader of the Catholic Church. Not only was he a Hitler Youth, but he also served in the German military. He was part of the German war machine, as 6 million Jews were sent to the death camps. Keep in mind, Pope Benedict was exonerated for his time spent as a soldier of Hitler. He called the Holocaust a dark time in his life and admitted his German past haunted him. But it was still wild to the rest of the world that someone who hailed Hitler could become the Pope. Of course, he wasn't the Pope for very long. Pope Benedict retired from the papacy in February 2013. It was supposedly his own decision, though he was the only modern pope to hang up the hat. He died this year in January at the age of 95. Curses in Revelation. The book of Revelation is the most dramatic and visually exciting of all the biblical books. It's full of prophetic visions of the end of the world, detailing the apocalypse with horrid realism. But what if the book of Revelation was a rip-off? New information from biblical researcher Dr. Michael Hulscher suggests many parts of the book use language taken directly from curse tablets used in ancient Rome. The Romans were obsessed with cursing each other. The curses were meant to bring their enemies harm and bad fortune. If someone was cheated or wronged, they would try to invoke the name of a god and curse the wrongdoer. When Dr. Hulscher investigated the phrases in Revelation, he found jarring similarities between the curses and the biblical text. For example, there is one passage in Revelation that talks about an angel throwing a stone into the sea and wishing doom upon God's enemies. It's the exact kind of language employed in curse tablets. Dr. Hulscher says that's because a Christian worshipper living 2,000 years ago was the one behind the book of Revelation. This was the same kind of person who would have been using curse tablets. It makes sense they employed the same language. Some biblical scholars have taken it a step beyond. Religious historian Elaine Pagels made a shocking claim in a 2012 interview with NPR. She said that John, the man who wrote the book of Revelation, was probably a refugee. He may have been a devout Christian who fled Jerusalem after Roman forces attacked. He would have been extremely angry at the Romans, so he wrote the book of Revelation as a kind of gigantic curse tablet. It was all to smite the Romans. The theory is supported by the content in the book of Revelation. A huge amount of the book revolves around Rome's destruction and the deaths of the emperors. Could the book of Revelation be nothing but one big curse tablet written by someone who hated the Romans? The Tulalip Indian School. It was the middle of the night at the Tulalip Indian School when Rose Freiberg was awoken from sleep with 8 other children. They were given plain brown sacks and told to pack their things. Then they were rushed out of the school dormitory and loaded onto a train. According to what Rose told interviewers 60 years later, the children were taken by train to a platform deep in the Nevada desert. Then they were loaded onto a wagon and pulled by horses to the Pyramid Lake Sanatorium. Although Rose wasn't sick or mentally ill, she spent the next years of her life locked in the sanatorium. She was only 11 years old. Rose was one of tens of thousands of Native American children who were taken out of school and separated from their families in the early 20th century. It was all thanks to the church and the US government. Advocates have called it a campaign of cultural genocide. Rose spent the majority of her childhood being transported from one boarding school to the next as a way to separate her from her heritage. It began with a Catholic priest in 1857. At the mouth of the Snohomish River, French priest Eugene Casimir Chouros began the first Native American boarding school. By 1868, the church's effort to rally Native Americans into boarding schools was financially backed by the federal government. The government signed a contract with missionaries in Tulalip. By the 1900s, schools across the country were inherited by federal officials. There were beatings, abuses, and traumas that only seemed to get worse. The schools reached their peak brutality in the 1920s. About 83% of Native Americans who were school-age were separated from their families. That's according to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. The bottom line is that priests backed by the church initiated the segregation of Native Americans in the middle of the 19th century. They visited tribes and baptized indigenous people. They built churches and schools to teach the young children the ways of their religion. As these schools came under the authority of the US government, things got worse. The horrors of the boarding schools are still implanted in the minds of living Native Americans today. Burning the witches. It wasn't until the early part of the 1900s that people started blaming the Catholic Church for the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. The terrible witch trials and burning of innocents was declared the result of the oppressive Catholic Church. More recently, revisionist historians have started to put some doubt into exactly who was responsible for burning witches. The Church certainly didn't help. They indeed fostered hate and suspicion of those who are different. For example, look at the Malleus Maleficarum. It was published by the Catholic Inquisition, illustrating the dangers of free-thinking women. It instructed clergymen on how to locate these free thinkers who were called witches. The book also included instructions on how to torture and kill them. The Church is without a doubt guilty for 300 years of witch hunts, but it may have had a lot to do with simple human nature. In the past couple years, historians have been looking at recorded testimonies taken during witch trials in Europe and Great Britain. Historian Jenny Gibbons sifted through a vast number of documents written in archaic language to get to the bottom of the mystery. But it helped because the documents show neighbors were largely responsible for people getting burned. Documents from the 16th century have revealed the majority of witch hunts were the result of vindictive neighbors and power-hungry local authorities. For example, take the case of Madalena Minka. She was visited by an old woman named Margrethe Noors while in the midst of childbirth. The old woman came into her home without being invited and stayed until the child was born. The old woman also brought wine, apples, and milk. When all was said and done, the old woman wanted money for her unsolicited services. When the young mother refused, the old woman said she would pay dearly. 3 weeks later, the young woman's baby passed. So Madalena Minka accused the old woman of being a witch. These were the most common accusations, often revolving around pregnant women and infants who suffered unexplained maladies. While the church did burn witches all over the place, much of the blame also lied alongside angry neighbors. What's the most shocking thing you've learned about the church today? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe and come back soon for more amazing videos.